Luke, a companion of Paul, gospel author, doctor, traveling missionary. So in today's class, we're going to continue talking about who was Luke and who was he writing to, when was he writing, where was he writing from, kind of building on some of the information that we got last class from the Bible Project video and from your textbooks. So, first of all, we have to know that Luke's connection to the apostles was actually the apostle Paul. So that was an important thing when we think about how did writings make their way into the biblical canon. Well, one of the ways that people knew they were authoritative is if the person had a connection to an apostle. So for Matthew and for John, that's easy. They themselves were apostles. They were disciples of Jesus. They were called by God, sent by God, done. Mark, if you'll remember, his gospel account is based on the remembrances of Peter. And so Peter was one of the 12 disciples. He's an apostle. Done. Luke is different. Luke doesn't have a connection to any of the 12 disciples, but he is connected to this guy, Paul. So in order for us to understand, kind of Luke's connection to the story of Jesus, we have to understand who Paul was. And we're going to talk more about Paul as we talk about the book of Acts and as we get into his letters. And we're going to come to find that Paul wrote like most of the New Testament. So Paul was a Pharisee. He was a Jewish man who originally we interact with under the name Saul in the book of Acts. And then we see how he has this encounter with the risen Christ. And he becomes a Christian. He becomes a follower of Jesus. And it's in that encounter that he gets this role of apostle. So apostle just comes from the Greek word, which means sent. And an apostle, capital A apostle, was anyone who was sent specifically by Jesus. And so even though Paul never knew Jesus when he was in his earthly ministry, he didn't know him before his death and resurrection, because he has this encounter with Jesus after he's ascended, he is considered one of the apostles. And so Paul and Luke are friends, they're travel companions, and it's through Paul's apostleship that Luke's writings get into the Bible. So, we talked about this on Monday. How do we know that Luke is the author for both books, Luke and Acts? Well, there's 4 main reasons. The first one, like you guys noticed in your worksheet, Luke and Acts start very similar. They're referred to the same person. They are clearly coming from the same author, going to the same audience. Also, Luke is mentioned as a companion of Paul in Paul's letter to the Colossians. In chapter 4, verses 10 through 14, Paul is writing these kind of, say hi to so-and-so and say hi to so-and-so type thing, and he mentions Luke. The we sections of Acts suggest that the author was with Paul on the missionary journeys. So there are these parts in the book of Acts where it's no longer talking in the third person, this is what he did, but it's talking in the second person, the first person. This is what we did. And so we know that Luke was traveling with Paul in those parts of the story. And then also, like your textbook noted, early tradition agrees that Luke was the author. So, who was Luke? Like we noted before, he was probably a Gentile, or it's possible he was a Hellenized Jew. So remember, if we think back to Hellenization, this idea of Greek culture, right? So he was either a Gentile or he was a Jewish person who just really adopted Greek culture. Why do we think that? Well, his name is Greek, right? The name Luke is not a Jewish name, it's a Greek name. The style, the way he writes, is more Greek than the other gospel authors. In that same part where Paul is kind of referencing different people in the book of Colossians, he seems to make a distinction between his Jewish companions and his not Jewish companions, and he kind of includes Luke in that latter category. And then the other thing is that Luke is a physician. Paul calls him a physician, and as we go through his gospel account, you'll notice he uses more kind of medical type language, just like how Matthew, who had been a tax collector, talks more about, money stories having to do with money and finances. Now, to be a doctor in the ancient world was different than being a doctor in the modern world, but they did have kind of an understanding of medicine in the Roman Empire. They would do things like tooth extractions and amputations, and so it's not that, back in Bible times everyone just thought everything was magic. Like, no, they did have some understanding of science. It was not what we have today, but Luke would have been trained in some sort of medical practice. Okay, so who is he writing to? Theophilus. Theophilus, which means in Greek, lover of God. And whether this is an individual person that was actually named Theophilus, or if this is just a title kind of talking about a community, people who love God, in either case, they're probably either Hellenized Jews themselves or Gentiles. Why do we think that? Well, for starters, Luke is not as concerned about Old Testament prophecy the way Matthew is. If you remember in Matthew's gospel account, just like over and over and over again, he was quoting from the Old Testament, showing how Jesus fulfilled this prophet and Jesus fulfilled this prediction. Luke is just not as concerned in pointing those things out. Also, the way he dates his story is according to secular or non-religious history. So we see in Luke chapter 1, verse 5, or Luke chapter 2, verse 1, he will talk about different people who are in charge in the Roman Empire. So it's not just talking about God and the way that God is moving, but he's actually giving like historical time periods based on who was in power. And then finally, in his genealogy, remember Matthew also had a genealogy in his account. Matthew's genealogy went back to Abraham because he was really concerned with showing how Jesus fulfilled those promises, starting with Abraham. But Luke's genealogy goes back even further. He connects Jesus all the way back to Adam, all the way back to the very first person in the Bible, because he's showing that Jesus is not just connected to this Jewish promise, but he's actually connected to the whole world, which would have been important for an audience that was made up of Gentiles or kind of more Greek-cultured Jews. When did Luke write his account? We don't know exactly, just like everything else, but it was probably around 60 AD. Scholars think this because Markan priority, right? They think Mark was written first, but they also think that it was written before the book of Acts, and because Acts ends abruptly before Paul is executed, some scholars think that that's because the book was finished being written, and Paul still was alive at the time, which means it would have to have been written between 64 and 67 AD, based on when we think Paul probably died. And then we definitely think it was written before 70 AD, in part because of this verse. In Luke 21:21, Jesus is giving warnings about the destruction of the temple and some of the coming difficulties that the people were going to face. And in that text, he says that they should flee to the mountains. And what we see is that actually a number of people didn't flee to the mountains. They fled elsewhere. And so the idea is if it was written after 70 AD, then Luke would have kind of corrected Jesus's teaching to say, well, Jesus said to go this way and everybody did. Because people didn't really heed Jesus's warning to flee to the mountains, that shows us that it was the text was probably written before 70 AD, before those events occurred. Finally, where was the gospel written? Likely in Rome, because of Acts 28:16. We know that that's where kind of the story ends, is with Paul in Rome in the book of Acts, and we believe that Paul wrote the letter to the Colossians from Rome, and that's where he mentions Luke. So there's this possibility that Luke was in Rome with Paul as he was writing his gospel account and then the book of Acts. Why? Why was it written? So Luke gives us his purpose statement right up front, Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. He says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." And it's really that bolded section that I want you guys to click into. If you have a flashcard out, that's what you would write. Purpose statement, Luke 1, 1 through 4, specifically so that the reader would know the certainty of the things they have been taught. Themes. So Matthew, remember, if we kind of review, some of Matthew's big themes were things like Jesus is the second and greater Moses, Jesus fulfilling Old Testament promises, Jesus being not just the king of the Jews, but the king for all people. And so Luke has his own portrayal or depiction of Jesus. And in Luke's gospel account, it's that Jesus is for everyone, including Gentiles, women, the poor, the sick, the downtrodden. These were basically people in society that society didn't really care about. And over and over and over again in Luke, Jesus does care. Jesus cares for these people. He goes out of his way to highlight them or lift them up or bless them, recognize them, and care for them. And we see this in Jesus' own purpose statement. So in Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 21, it says this: He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom from the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." So just a few things to note. First of all, that fulfilled word, right? The Bible Project video pointed out this idea of Jesus fulfilling the Old Testament promises. So even though that's not Luke's number one focus, this idea of fulfillment does come back over and over again in the gospel account. But then looking at those other bolded words, right? He's proclaiming good news to the poor, freedom for the prisoners, sight for the blind, set the oppressed free. And then the year of the Lord's favor, as the Bible Project video pointed out. This is referring to the Year of Jubilee, or this year in ancient Jewish custom where the slaves were supposed to be released and land was supposed to be given back to whoever had owned it. And it was supposed to be a big party, and a party specifically for people who kind of got the raw end of the deal in society. And so over and over and over again in Luke's gospel account, Luke is highlighting these people and showing how Jesus is caring for these people, even when other people around him aren't. So there's a number of passages unique to Luke, and you guys are going to do a worksheet where you're going to take a few of these passages and read them and think, how does this passage really show Luke's intention, Luke's themes, Luke's specific portrait of Jesus? Why does it make sense that even though Mark and Matthew and John don't include this story, that Luke would? How does this story elevate somebody who is poor, someone who is maybe sick, or a woman, or oppressed, or a Samaritan, or a tax collector, someone who the rest of society would have ignored? And so you're going to look these passages up: Luke 10, Luke 15, Luke 16, Luke 17, Luke 19,